Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to talk about harvesting and dehydrating lavender and the various ways that you may want to do it depending on how you're using your lavender. And just so you know right up front, this is just the way I've come to do things. I'm always experimenting and doing things different ways as I go along, and even since I started my channel back in 2016, I do things differently now than I did back then when it comes to harvesting, dehydrating, and more. And some of that also depends on how young or old the various herbs are, and each herb is also different in the way I harvest it, so it's all going to depend on what it is and how it grows. But today is specifically about lavender. Now, when I first started growing lavender, I was growing it just for the flowers. And so I was just picking the flower heads when they would come on and dehydrating them. Sometimes cutting whole stems and using the whole thing, but mostly just the flowers. And then it wasn't long after that I decided, well, what about the leaves? And so I got to looking into leaves, and sure enough, they're edible, they're tasty. I actually like the flavor of the leaves better than I do the lavender flowers when it comes to using in food. And the parts of the lavender you use and dehydrate is all going to depend on how you plan on using it. If you're going to use it in food, well, do you like the flavor of lavender flowers? Some people do, some people don't. Some people use the flowers in like a lavender lemonade or lavender bread. And though I have used them in tea now and then, I can't, it just by itself as a tea, no, it has to be mixed with other things for me to actually enjoy the flavor at all. And I think I do have a video out on a couple of, at least one lavender tea. But the leaves I've used in food quite a bit. I've used it in savory dishes. I've used it fresh in salads, or even if I just make some rice, I love to take fresh lavender leaves and fresh thyme leaves and add to my rice along with some red pepper. I love that. So I use the stem, the leaves, and the flowers. And I personally believe that you can find benefits in all of the aerial parts of the plant, possibly the roots, but I haven't looked into it. However, what I want to do is link you back to a video I did more specifically on the medicinal benefits of lavender. So please go check that out if you're looking more about its medicinal benefits and how I use it. I'll talk a little bit about how I use it because that's going to play into how I dehydrate and why I do it the way I do. And how you harvest and the way you separate out your lavender to dry it is all going to be dependent on how you want to use it. So I've been doing some different experimenting this year with what's the easiest way to handle it, especially if you're considering using all parts of the lavender, or if you're wanting to separate them out. Now, some people may just want the flowers, some people may just want the leaves, some people may want the flowers and leaves and not the stems. And because of the way I'm using my lavender mostly, I will use the stems as well. And so in this case, when I went to dehydrate it, I just harvested the stems, and I'm going to show you some pictures here of the lavender out back. I have several lavender plants, but the big one out back, that it was just a little guy when I planted it several years ago, but now it's pretty huge, and now it's just getting too big. And so what I'm having to do is cut it way back, and so perfect time for me to start using those stems. And so you can see the pictures, a little video clip of what it looked like before I started harvesting it, and some pictures as I was harvesting it. And I'm still working on it. There's still flowers I got to go cut down. And I'm trying to prune that way back to get it back to a smaller size again, because I've kind of let my lavender go out of control for the past couple of years. So in this case, all I did was I brought the stems in like this. As you can see, these ones I just harvested this morning. And I cut them in half and just threw them onto the tray like this. Once they're all dry, what I was doing is picking out the thicker stems, and I decided I just didn't want the thicker stems taking up so much room in my jar, so those I was discarding like that, but the smaller ones I'm just breaking up smaller this way. And then I'm putting them in my jars. So here's the jar that I most recently topped off. And then here's a jar I just started. And I might even get 3 full jars this year. So that'll be pretty cool because I go through a lot of lavender. And what I use it for is infusing into an oil for my skin cream. It's one of the many herbs that I use in there. And I will link back to the video I did kind of recently on natural skincare. I talk about what I do as well as the many herbs and other things you can use to help give your skin better health, and that's both topically and taking internally. Now I'm going to get to how you can prepare the herbs, but let me show you, since I'm here, how I do this by putting in the jar. If you don't want the stems and you decided to dry it like I did here, you can just strip the flowers and the dried leaves off the stems this way. Doing it in clusters is the fastest way, but you may not pull all the leaves and flowers off if you do it that way. So you want to really pay attention to what you're doing. If you're going to use the stems, like you see me pulling out some of those bigger stuff, then you don't have to strip them. You can just break them up into smaller pieces like so. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and probably use most of the stems in this since I have them here. Again, this is if you're going to use all the parts in the same thing like I'm doing for the skin cream. I'll talk more about separating them out in a minute if that's what you prefer to do. Again, it's all about how you want to use them. Okay, I just want to get a little bit of this done. And then I'll take my fingers and just really break it up even smaller. Hopefully you can see that. And then I take my canning funnel and just pour it into my jar. And what I like to do, especially when I got a lot of stems, and this goes for any dried herb, is I like to take my tamper that Patrick made me. I can use for kimchi or whatever else. And I like to really tamp those down, and I'll break them up and pack them in tight. So that'll make less airspace in there, and thus I can fit more herbs in there as well. And then when I vacuum seal it, that's definitely going to help also keep them fresher because I've got less airspace in there. So that's how I'm doing this right now. Now, I used to just harvest the flowers until I became more and more convinced that you can find the same skin benefiting properties in all of the aerial parts of the plant. So I use all of them in there so I can make the most of that. However, I do think most of it is probably found in the flower. Now let's come back to some ways that you can prepare the lavender for dehydrating if you're wanting to separate all parts out. The easiest way to do it is to do that before you dehydrate rather than the way I did it where I just threw everything on there. So the easiest way to do this is just get a few at a time, strip the flowers off like that and throw them on there, and then strip the leaves off. Let's say you're not wanting to use the stems, and then you can either put them on a separate dehydrator tray or you can set them off to the side. But I suggest, especially if you're doing a lot and you want the leaves and flowers separate, put the leaves on a separate tray, and then the flowers on their own tray. But since I'm using these all in the same purpose right now, I'm just mixing it all up so I don't care. But yes, the easiest way is to go ahead and strip all this before you dehydrate if you're not wanting those stems in there. And if you're wanting to separate them all out. Sometimes you can grab a pretty good cluster, but what I find if you get too much at a time, you'll have these shorter ones in there, and you won't be able to strip all the leaves and flowers off easily that way. So it's better to just get 1, 2, or 3 at a time. Let's try this. This is kind of a small cluster. There we go. But then when I get down to the leaves, it's harder for me to get all the leaves off of those stems when I have too big of a cluster. So this can be a little bit time consuming, but it doesn't have to be that bad. At any rate, again, it just depends. So if you're going to use the stems, the fastest way to do it is just to go ahead and do what I did. But obviously, especially if you're wanting to use the flowers maybe for one purpose and the leaves for another purpose, such as seasoning. Some people like to use it as a rosemary replacement. It has a similar flavor to rosemary, but it's not exactly the same. It's definitely more mild and a little bit sweeter. So if you like rosemary, but you think it's a little strong, you might like lavender leaves better. And so I do recommend, and I've done it many times, usually every year, I will harvest the leaves by themselves. Now, the best time to do that, though, is before it even starts shooting off those stems to make flowers. Because the first thing to start to grow in the lavender is the leaves, and they'll grow in nice little clusters. And then you can go out there early in the spring and just start cutting a bunch of those down, and you'll get a lot of leaves. But you do it early enough, though, that the plant has time to then shoot out its flowers. So that you're going to typically find with most herbs, if you're harvesting for the leaves, you want to do that before they start to flower. And even if you're harvesting for the flowers, but you want to use the leaves as well, it's still good to do that, because that can also increase the flower output, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I got a lot more flowers this year, is because last year I didn't harvest any leaves because I had so much dehydrated up. This year I went and harvested a bunch of leaves, and then I got a lot more flowers. So that will also increase your flower output. But you can still take the leaves off these long stems. If you have plenty, you don't have to worry about that. You can just pull the flowers off. So let's get on to then the actual dehydrating. So I never dehydrate any herb above 115 degrees, and only certain herbs do I even do that high. Typically 105 to 110 degrees is a better temperature. Some people go even lower, like 95. You just got to watch your herbs. Some do better at 105, like if they're more delicate herbs, they bruise easily, use the lowest heat. If they're tougher herbs, you got a lot of stems in here like this, it might take a while to dry. If they take longer to dry, they usually can handle a little bit higher heat. But again, never go above 115. That's my personal opinion, and some people would say don't go above 110. I just kind of know with experience of what temperature is best with which herb. And so you just got to watch it and pay attention and always check. Now you can see for this, I'm actually using my Nesco. And the reason why that is because we are currently in the time of the year we're now getting enough solar power. I can do a lot of dehydrating on the solar power and do it outside, so I keep the heat outside. So I like to use my Nescos for that because they're lighter weight than my Cosori, easier to pack around. Now when you're using a Nesco or a stackable type dehydrator where you've got the heat either at the bottom or at the top, you got to really be paying attention, because whatever tray is closest to the heat source and the fan is going to dry first. And so you want to get those off there, and then that's also going to help the other things dry faster if you get the dried ones out of the way first, so that then the heat and the fan can be closer to the ones that are drying. Now my heat source on my Nescos comes from the top, so it's always the top trays I'm going to check first. If your heat source comes from the bottom, check the bottom trays first. And then I just remove them one by one. Sometimes I'll put fresh trays after I take those off, fill those same trays up with more herbs and put them on the bottom so that I can keep pulling them off this way. Now if you're using a cabinet style dehydrator like an Excalibur, the Cosori like I have, the Cabela's and other such type cabinet ones, most of them should dry very evenly. My Cosori works perfectly. I have everything dries in the same amount of time and evenly, so I know I can, whatever I stick in there, and that's also why I don't like to use it as much for herbs, because I can't really mix things up with a Cosori like I can with a Nesco. So with a Nesco, the stackable one, I can put the stuff that needs a higher heat and more time to dehydrate on the top trays, and the more delicate herbs on the bottom farther away from the heat, and that way I could still set the temp at 115, and they're going to typically dry pretty much in the same amount of time. Now if it's all the same thing, like all lavender, then obviously the top trays are going to dry first, and then you just kind of rotate them. Now generally speaking, a lot of your very dried herbs do not need to be vacuum sealed. I just like to take that extra step, because not everything has to be vacuum sealed, but some things do. Some dried fruits, vegetables, and more need to be vacuum sealed to better preserve them. Most herbs do not need to, but you will retain their flavor better if they're sitting back there for a long time, for a few years, if you vacuum seal. Those of you who've been following me for any length of time will know that the most common method I use for vacuum sealing has been the brake bleeder pump, which you can pick up from $20 to $25 on Amazon, and I'll link to one below, and the Food Saver tops, which again, they usually range between $20 and $25 for the set of two. I didn't bring the regular mouth out. And usually come with an accessory hose too, so if you actually have a Food Saver machine, you can use it with that. Anyway, this is the most common way. You've seen me do this in a lot of videos, where I use the brake bleeder pump. I stick this tip that comes with it, I just press and hold it in there, and then I pump it by resting the brake bleeder pump on the counter and pressing with the heel of my hand until the needle gets up to about right in here, at least where it says 400 or 15. But I usually like to go farther, or just keep going until the needle stops moving. But I recently came across this set, which was actually a better deal. Now, the only reason I bought it was so I could try it out and see if it was worth recommending, because it is an off-brand. It's not the Food Saver brand like these, but it also comes with a nice little pump. Now, I did a more detailed video on this. I'll link to down below if you want more information about it, and I'll also link to the set down below. And I paid $20 for the full set, and it came with several different things. But anyway, I'm actually finding that the only downside to this particular set over the Food Saver is the little handle at the top to make it easier to pull up. However, the regular mouth on this works way better than the regular mouth Food Saver brand. And so this, for the same price, it might cost you to buy a brake bleeder pump or the Food Saver tops. For the same price, you can get a pump and the lid. So I'm really liking this, and so I'm still working with this a lot because I want to test and see how long this little bicycle tire type pump is going to work. So you got a silicone end here. You don't have anything you have to stick down into the hole. The silicone just makes, if you hold it firmly enough, is going to be tight enough against the top of your jar sealer, and it will work also with the Food Saver brand, that you don't need to have anything actually sticking down into the hole, and then you just pump, understanding that the pressure on this is you're going to feel it as you pull upwards rather than pushing downwards like you would when you're pumping up a bicycle tire. And it will get tougher and tougher. And I'm not sure, but this method, I wish I could say for sure, this method might be easier with those people who have problems with their hands, like arthritis and carpal tunnel, than using the brake bleeder pump. But personally, I can't really tell for sure. But anyway, there you go. Oh, I forgot to show you. I forgot to do the test. I always test by doing this to make sure it is sealed. Then I do put my bands on snugly. Not super tight, just snug. And this is vacuum sealed, dried goods. Yes, it is good to put the bands on. A lot of people get confused because they hear, oh, I heard you're not supposed to keep the bands on jars. Well, that's for pressure canned or water bath can stuff. And you're not supposed to keep the bands on the jars. You can put them back on some jars if you do it the right way. And I go over that in another video that I will link to down below. But when you're talking about dried goods, I recommend always putting those bands on and putting them on snugly. Because if your jar comes unsealed in storage, which it can still happen, you still got the band holding that lid tightly in place, and it's still going to help keep the food fresher. And if you go to grab that jar, not realizing the off the shelf, not realizing it's come unsealed, then, and that lid's just sitting on there, it's going to go flying off, and all your dried goods are going to fly out of the jar. If you do things very con brio like I do, you know, you're always moving fast, and yeah, stuff like that always tends to happen to me. So, and there you go. And then however you want to use your lavender flowers or leaves, or flowers and leaves, or flowers, leaves, and stems is entirely up to you. Again, please go check out the video I did on lavender and its many benefits and the ways that I use it or have used it. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.